It's Thursday, April 30th, 2020. Yesterday, we looked at the story about the day that Jesus visited the village of Nain and stopped a funeral procession for a young man who had died probably the day before. Jesus walked up to the mother of that young man as she walked in the funeral procession behind her dead son. And Jesus spoke to this broken-hearted woman and told her not to cry. Now, Jesus didn't approach her because he somehow felt obligated to her. No, he approached her because, according to the scripture, his heart went out to her. She was in need, and she didn't even know who Jesus was, and she had no idea what he was able to do. So it didn't occur to her to approach him with her need. After all, her husband was already dead, and her only son, her only child, had just died as well. And she had been left completely alone. So it must have seemed to her that there was nothing that anyone could do for her. That is, until Jesus stopped the procession and spoke to her dead son and told him to get up just before he restored him to his mother. Talk about meeting the need of the moment. Jesus moved in her direction, and he took the initiative without waiting for her to ask. And we wondered yesterday why he would do that. Why would he reach out to this woman who hadn't asked for his help? And why would he take the time to help someone who didn't know who he was? I think we concluded yesterday that it had to be love. I can't think of anything else that would have motivated Jesus that day. Hey, there's something that I'd like you to do. Hit pause in just a moment and go grab a piece of paper and a pen and try not to get distracted until you come back and hit play again. If you're not in a place where you can stop to write, then you may be able to work without paper and pencil, as I'm only going to ask you to think through one thing, so you may be able to remember your answer to the question. But if you're in a place where you can write, do the pause thing now. Do you have your paper and pencil? Good. Here's what I want you to do. Take a moment to think it through and then write a brief description of yourself. Now, I don't want the airport description of yourself, the one that you would give me if we haven't met and I'm supposed to pick you up at the train station. For me, my airport description might be I'm bald on the top and tend to bulge at the sides. But given that description, you'd be as likely to come home with a used tire as you would be to come home with me. But that's not the kind of description that I'm looking for, especially for you, because I want you to focus more on the characteristics that define you, the things that set you apart, the things that most explain who you are. What I really want by way of a description is for you to fill in the blank. I am the one who, I'm the guy who, I'm the ballerina who, I'm the princess who, I'm the macho man who, I'm the player who. We don't need a paragraph here, just a few words that describe you. If you need to hit pause again, go ahead and do that. But remember, this should be the thing that defines you, and it's most likely something that's on the tip of your tongue. So just go ahead, knee-jerk this thing, and write down that description of you. You got it done? Fold it in half, then set it aside. We'll come back to it later. I don't know how often you may have traveled by train. I tend not to travel by train here in the U.S., but I do travel by train extensively when I'm in Singapore. I continue to be amused by the fact that there is never anyone driving the train as it makes its way deep down below the city of Singapore. The train stops at all the stops and waits for a minute or so for people to get on and off, and then it starts up again. Sometimes along the way, the train will stop in the middle of nowhere while it waits for another train to clear the track ahead or behind. It always arrives at an entirely predictable time, and it does all of that without anyone to drive it. Now, that's not always true of trains or subways in the U.S., especially in the Northeast where I grew up, because up there's always someone driving the train and making sure that it arrives on time and safely, if it at all possibly can. And that was especially true of trains in the U.S. in the 19th century. In fact, I heard a story told about a train switchman who was working back then and who was responsible for a swing bridge that crossed a river. In some ways, his job was simple. At the pull of a lever, the bridge would swing to the middle of the river and be parallel to the flow of the river so that a boat or ship could pass by. The bridge switchman would let the boat pass by and then pull the lever again and swing the bridge so that once again it spanned the river so that trains could pass. This particular switchman loved his job and When he married, he moved with his wife into the little house that the railroad provided, and soon the couple had a son who would soon be 4 years old. And that little boy loved trains as much as his daddy did. In fact, the switchman got into the habit of taking his 3-year-old with him to work. The boy would sit in his father's lap and help him to pull the massive lever that activated the huge gears below them that made the bridge pivot to allow a boat to pass by, and then with a push of the lever, the bridge would pivot back to allow the train to pass across the river. It was great fun. One day the switchman and his son were sitting there talking, as fathers and sons often do, when they both heard a large boat on the river as it sounded its horn, the signal that requested that the bridge be pivoted so that the boat could pass. The switchman had the train schedule memorized and knew that the Western Express was due soon, but he also knew that there was ample time to pivot the bridge and let the boat pass. With the help of his son, he pulled the lever and the massive gears began to turn, and soon the bridge was swung into place and the boat started by. The boat was moving upstream, and just as it drew even with the switchman, one of the gears that drove the propeller broke and the boat began to founder. The current took over and the boat began to drift back to where it had come from, but it was moving entirely too slowly. The switchman knew that the Western Express was just around the bend, and he was nervously waiting for the boat to drift back to the point where the swing of the bridge back into place wouldn't hit the boat. Seconds later, he realized that the boat was just out of the way, and he'd finally be able to pull the lever and swing the bridge back into place just in time for the oncoming train to make it safely across. And that's when he noticed, to his horror, that in the confusion, his 3-year-old son had slipped down off of his lap and was well below him, playing among the massive gears that swung the bridge. He didn't have time to jump down and get him, and he didn't have time even to think. The moment was almost already gone when he would be able to pull the lever and have the bridge back in place for the train to rumble across. He knew that he only had 2 choices before him: leave the lever as it was and watch the Western Express plunge into the river at great loss of life, or pull the lever so that the people aboard the train would be safe. But that choice would end the life of the son that he loved. I don't know how he found the courage, if that in fact is the word, but he pulled the lever, saving the lives of everyone aboard the train, but ending the life of his only son. It said that as the train roared across the bridge, not a single passenger looked into the eyes of the switchman. If they had, they would not have known the reason for the tears that ran down his agonized face. As they hurried across the bridge, the passengers on that train had no way of knowing or understanding how much love that train switchman had shown for his fellow man. Now, having told that story, I'm confident that I don't have to take the time to draw out the illustration or what it means. I believe that this is the picture that we all have of God, and that awful moment when he pulled the lever that set the plan in motion that ended in the death of his only son. We don't have to draw out the parallel between the unaware and uncaring people on that train and the people who fill our world today. Those of us who follow Jesus today can clearly see the connection between the agony of the switchman and the agony that God the Father and God the Son went through in that awful night as Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Our time is nearly up once again, so I'd like to encourage you to take some time to pray. As you pray, take a moment and put yourself to the best of your ability into the story of the train switchman, because the switchman is tangible. He's touchable. God is so other, so far removed from us that we can't begin to imagine that he would even have feelings. We can't begin to imagine the awfulness of the moment when, as Jesus hung on the cross, he looked heavenward, expecting to see how pleased his Father was that he was doing what the Father had asked him to do, even though Jesus had not wanted to do it. And that was something that he had agonized over in prayer the night before. In that moment on the cross, Jesus looked heavenward and did not see his Father pleased. Instead, he saw his Father with his back turned, forsaking his Son because of the awfulness of my sin and yours that the Son carried that day. Those ideas are so far beyond our comprehension, and God is so far beyond our reach and grasp. But that switchman is touchable. He's tangible. So as you pray, Put yourself in that switchman's place, giving up your child. And then ask God to open your eyes and to help you to understand how much it cost him to give up his only son. Ask him to reveal to you how very much he loved you back then and how very much he loves you still today. Let's talk again tomorrow.